It is late evening. The kitchen is quiet, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of a laptop screen. Sitting at the table are two people, looking over their credit card statement from the past month. They are tired, they are stressed, and they are currently arguing over a $14 monthly charge for a streaming service they have barely watched in 6 months. The conversation is tense. It is an argument about discipline, about waste, about being responsible. Finally, with a few clicks, the subscription is canceled. They close the laptop. They take a deep breath. They feel a sudden, measurable sense of victory. They have found a leak, and they have patched it. They have taken control of their finances. But sitting inside a manila folder, just 2 feet away on that exact same kitchen table, is the closing paperwork for their home. Last month, they signed a 30-year mortgage. They accepted a rate that was 0.5% higher than the market average because the process of shopping around for a better lender felt too complicated. They were exhausted by the paperwork, intimidated by the financial jargon, and eager to just get the deal done. That single decision, not shopping for a better rate, will cost them over $60,000 in additional interest over the life of the loan. Why do two intelligent adults fight bitterly over a $14 subscription while completely ignoring a $60,000 penalty? This is not a failure of intelligence. This is a fundamental feature of human psychology. It is a phenomenon formally recognized in the 1950s as Parkinson's law of triviality, sometimes called the bike shed effect. The human brain struggles to conceptualize massive, life-altering, structural problems. The terror of a $60,000 financial burden is too large, too abstract, and too complex to process. So the brain desperately seeks safety. It hyperfixates on the trivial, the microscopic, the streaming service, the coffee.
We have been taught for decades to treat financial success primarily as a problem of personal discipline. We are told that wealth is built in these tiny, agonizing daily sacrifices. Budgeting does help. Small expenses do matter. Creating a gap between what you earn and what you spend is the mathematical foundation of personal finance. But our cultural obsession with tiny expenses can often become a psychological shield. It can distract us from the much larger structural financial decisions that actually dictate our future. To understand why we focus so heavily on the small things, you have to look at the most famous piece of modern financial advice ever created. It is a concept widely known as the latte factor. The premise is universally recognized. If you skip a $5 coffee every morning and instead invest that money in the stock market, the miracle of compound interest will eventually turn you into a millionaire. It is an incredibly comforting narrative. It places the power of wealth creation entirely within your daily control. But when financial researchers critically evaluate the math behind the earliest versions of this concept, popularized in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a more complicated reality emerges. The math works, but only under highly specific assumptions. To reach the massive numbers promised in the books, the original calculations often assumed double-digit annual returns. They rarely factored in the silent drag of inflation over 30 years. They did not account for the management fees of the mutual funds. They often ignored the capital gains taxes that would eventually be owed. When you adjust the spreadsheet for the friction of the real world, the final number shrinks considerably. The problem is not that saving $5 a day is useless. Saving money is a highly effective, necessary habit. The problem is the belief that eliminating a daily coffee is mathematically equivalent to solving a massive deficit in housing costs, income stagnation, or healthcare debt. The math of the latte is used to explain away the math of the macroeconomy. But this intense cultural focus on individual financial morality did not begin with modern spreadsheets. To trace its origins, we have to look back at the people who first wrote the rules. It is 1926. In a small printing office in Denver, Colorado, a man is sitting at a desk writing a story. His name is George S. Clason. He is a publisher, a mapmaker, and he has recently experienced a severe financial failure. His business, the Clason Map Company, which published the first road atlas of the United States and Canada, has collapsed in bankruptcy. But Clason is a brilliant copywriter. He begins to write a series of fictional parables set in the dusty streets of ancient Mesopotamia.
He invents characters, he writes about ancient clay tablets. He claims to reveal the forgotten financial secrets of the wealthiest civilization in history. He coins a phrase that will be repeated by financial advisors for the next century: pay yourself first. These stories will eventually be bound together into a famous book called The Richest Man in Babylon. Today, millions of people read it, assuming they are absorbing the timeless historical wisdom of antiquity. But there were no ancient clay tablets. The stories were modern creations. Klassen published them as a series of promotional pamphlets, and the history of how these pamphlets reached the public is deeply intertwined with the history of modern banking. Klassen sold millions of copies of these stories directly to United States banks and insurance companies. The banks printed their own corporate logos on the covers and handed them out to everyday customers. The foundational text of modern wealth creation, the strict moral directive to save 10% of your income no matter the circumstance, was popularized as a marketing tool, distributed by the exact institutions that relied on customer deposits to build their own capital. But a financial framework can mean something completely different depending on who is using it and what economic power they possess in the world. 75 years before George Clason wrote his parables, a Japanese journalist named Hani Motoko was sitting at a wooden table in Tokyo. It is the winter of 1904. She is Japan's first female journalist, living in the Meiji era, a society where women had incredibly limited financial independence and were largely excluded from the formal economy. Hani Motoko introduces a system to her readers. She calls it kakebo.
It is a meticulous, daily physical ledger of household income and expenditures. Today, if you search for kakebo on the internet, you will find it marketed as a trendy, minimalist aesthetic, a Zen art of mindful budgeting. But when it was created, it was not a lifestyle trend. It was a practical tool of financial autonomy. By introducing a rigorous method for tracking household spending, Hani Motoko provided women with a structured way to manage domestic finances, allowing them to navigate the economic restrictions of their time and carve out a measure of financial stability for their families. A few years later, across the ocean, in the rapidly expanding factory towns of England and America, another famous budgeting system is born out of pure logistical necessity. Today, we call it envelope budgeting. Modern financial apps digitize the concept. Creators sell courses on how to organize your cash into different categories. It is viewed as a clever behavioral trick. But stand outside an early 20th century textile mill. Watch the workers line up at the end of the week. Many of these industrial workers operate entirely in a cash-based economy. They do not have checking accounts. They do not have access to formal consumer banking infrastructure. They are paid their wages in physical paper packets. Families would take this physical cash back to their homes and divide it into literal tin cans or envelopes. One for coal, one for the grocer, one for rent. Physical envelope budgeting was not invented as a wealth optimization strategy. It was a cash-based survival mechanism for the unbanked working class. Over the next century, as consumer banking modernized and money became invisible, this physical necessity was transformed by the financial industry into a behavioral product. And the reason the physical envelope system was so effective is because it accidentally leveraged one of the most powerful aspects of human biology. Human beings have a deeply complicated psychological relationship with the medium of money. In a famous 2008 neuroeconomic study, scientists put consumers in functional MRI scanners while they made purchasing decisions. They flashed images of consumer goods on a screen, followed by their prices. They were watching specific regions of the brain. What they found altered our understanding of consumer behavior. The researchers observed that when consumers are confronted with prices and the anticipation of losing money, brain regions associated with negative emotional responses, loss, and discomfort become highly active. Handing over physical cash forces you to confront that loss directly. It introduces psychological friction. The financial industry understands this friction intimately, and they understand that if you remove the friction, you change the behavior. In 2001, researchers at MIT held a silent auction for highly coveted Boston Celtics tickets. They divided the room into two groups. The first group was told they had to pay with physical cash. The second group was told they had to pay with a credit card. When the bids were collected, the illusion of human mathematical rationality disappeared. The participants paying with a credit card bid up to 100% more for the exact same tickets. When you remove the physical friction of paper money, You create psychological distance. Digital abstraction makes the money feel less tangible. The behavioral restraint simply weakens. If you want to understand how deep this psychological distance goes, look at a 2009 study documenting something called the denomination effect. If you hand a human being five $20 bills, they are highly likely to break them. They will buy lunch, they will buy a coffee, the money slowly evaporates. But if you give that exact same human being a single, crisp $100 bill, they will often aggressively refuse to spend it. The mathematical value is identical, but the behavioral hurdle of breaking the large bill feels like a more significant loss. Because we are so vulnerable to this psychological friction, financial advisors attempt to build rules to protect us from ourselves. One of the most common pieces of advice is the 72-hour rule. If you want to buy something expensive, you must wait 72 hours before completing the transaction. We are told this gives us time to consult our budget and make a logical decision.
But the power of the rule is purely behavioral. When you sit on your couch late at night, scrolling through an online store, adding items to your cart, your brain is experiencing the intense emotional anticipation of a reward. The 72-hour rule simply introduces friction between the desire and the purchase. Waiting allows the emotional intensity of the moment to slowly decline. It gives the prefrontal decision-making process an opportunity to step in and evaluate the purchase rationally after the initial anticipation has faded. But when we attempt to take these rational rules and apply them perfectly across an entire budget, the systems often collapse under their own weight. In 1969, an account manager at Texas Instruments named Peter Pyre developed a concept called zero-based budgeting. The premise was highly logical. Every single dollar of a budget must be accounted for. Every expense must be justified from zero every single month, with no assumptions carried over from the past. In a highly controlled corporate environment, it was an effective tool for identifying waste. It looked brilliant on a whiteboard. It was so compelling that in 1977, President Jimmy Carter decided to implement zero-based budgeting across the entire United States federal government. The result was an incredibly difficult lesson in the limits of human administration. The friction of complexity overwhelmed the process. Forcing thousands of departments to justify every single minor expense from zero created an immense administrative burden and a mountain of physical paperwork. The complexity and the sheer time required to maintain the system made it nearly impossible to sustain at a massive scale. By the early 1980s, the government largely moved away from it. Zero-based budgeting requires a level of continuous, flawless energy that is incredibly difficult for human beings to maintain over long periods of time, whether in a federal agency or in a household spreadsheet.
Because human behavior is messy, we constantly search for simpler formulas. In 2005, a Harvard bankruptcy law professor named Elizabeth Warren published a book detailing a framework that would eventually become known as the 50-30-20 rule. 50% of income to needs, 30% to wants, 20% to savings. Today, this rule is repeated across the internet as a definitive lifestyle formula for building wealth. But the framework was not originally designed as a guaranteed path to riches. Elizabeth Warren developed it after spending the 1990s researching why middle-class, two-income families were going bankrupt. She observed that families were taking on massive fixed overhead, expensive mortgages and car payments. The 50% cap on needs was intended as a practical way to think about household financial stability. It was a structural guideline to ensure that if a family experienced a sudden shock, like the loss of a job, their fixed costs would not instantly drag them under. It was a pragmatic evaluation of risk, which the internet eventually transformed into a rigid rule for everyday life. But human beings do not follow rigid mathematical rules cleanly. And to understand why, you have to look at the work of Nobel Prize-winning economist Richard Thaler and a concept called mental accounting. Imagine a person who has $5,000 sitting in a savings account. They have proudly labeled this account their vacation fund. This same person also has a $4,000 balance on a credit card, which is charging them 24% interest. Mathematically, the solution is obvious. Pay off the credit card immediately. Money is fungible. $1 in savings is mathematically identical to $1 of debt. But psychologically,
They are not the same. The person will willingly bleed cash to the bank every single month in high interest payments, completely refusing to touch the savings account. They have assigned an emotional label to those dollars. To use the vacation money to pay off the credit card feels like a psychological loss. They are protecting an emotional category, even while the mathematical reality drains their net worth.
This desire for clean rules and emotional categories extends to the very end of our lives. For decades, the ultimate goal of the extreme budgeter has been the 4% rule, the widely accepted framework that if you withdraw 4% of your investment portfolio during your first year of retirement and adjust for inflation thereafter, your money will last for the rest of your life. The rule originates from a highly influential 1994 paper by financial advisor William Bengen. But a framework derived from historical data is not a law of nature. Bengen's original research was based on specific historical assumptions. It assumed a standard 30-year retirement horizon. It relied on historical market returns and specific asset allocations. But economic environments change. In periods of exceptionally high market valuations and high inflation, the math shifts. The sequence in which you experience investment returns matters deeply. If the market drops significantly in the first few years of retirement, withdrawing a fixed percentage can deplete the portfolio much faster than the historical averages suggest. Furthermore, for someone who retires very early, relying on a rule designed for a 30-year horizon becomes highly complex when the money needs to last 40 or 50 years. The spreadsheet assumes stability. The real world provides volatility. When you look at the full history of how we manage our money, from the mapmaker in Denver to the industrial wage packets to the MRI scans of the human brain and the complex rules we invent to feel safe, you begin to understand the true nature of financial advice. Budgeting matters. Discipline is essential. Tracking your expenses is a highly effective tool for managing behavior and creating awareness. But a budget is a tool. It is not a complete explanation of wealth. Financial outcomes are not solely determined by how aggressively you optimize your daily spending. They are heavily dictated by your income, the cost of housing, the interest rates you pay, the silent drain of inflation, the tax code, and the broader economic environment you live in. We are taught to look through a microscope when we often need to be looking through a telescope sitting in the folder. A coffee can matter, but obsessing over the coffee can sometimes become a very quiet, very comfortable way of avoiding the decision